Love them or hate them, Pixel phones have gone through quite a lot of changes since they were first introduced. We had some ups and downs throughout the years of Pixel, but how did we actually get to the point where we're at today? Well, it took some trial and error, and today we're going to be ranking all of the Pixel phones throughout the years, I guess. I know, it's a really original idea, tier list, wow, very cool, but it's something I'm interested in, so I figured I'd just show you guys what I think of every Pixel ever made, and yeah, that's cool. And yes, I am going to be using a Pixel 2 XL to do the actual tier list rating thing, so I guess that's also very cool. Anyways, starting off with the Pixel 1 and 1 XL, and I am grouping all of the Pixels I think it makes sense to group, like all of the Pixels that are basically just like a bigger version of the same Pixel without any discernible difference. There are some exceptions to this rule, and you'll see them, but just keep that in mind. If they are grouped together, it's the XL and the non-XL model. Anyways, the Pixel 1 and 1 XL, it was like a pretty decent start to Pixel, and it did bring some very good HDR processing to photos, as well as unlimited original quality backups to Google Photos, which is pretty cool actually. People still buy them today just for that, so that's something to take into account. And I also believe it was only promised 2 years of OS updates, but it got 3, so that's cool as well. There wasn't anything majorly wrong with it, it just wasn't a super like unique option, I guess. And some people would say that the Nexus lineup was better than the first Pixel, so I'll put it at B tier. I think B tier is pretty fair. There's going to be much better Pixels released later on and much worse Pixels released later on, so we'll leave some room for those. But yeah, B tier for Pixel 1 and 1 XL seems pretty fair to me. Next we have the Pixel 2, and this is the non-XL variant. Like I said, I will split up some of the phones into different entries just in case they have some glaring differences in terms of design or whatever. But the Pixel 2, now the Pixel 2 series, they had some very, very crazy processing with their pictures. Like even if you got a Pixel 2 nowadays and took a picture with it, it would come out very, very good looking. I'm going to put the standard 2 at A tier, just because it is a bit of a Chungus bezel phone, but the 2XL I think is the more iconic one, and that's gonna get the first S tier spot. People still think the 2XL is the best Pixel released up until this day, and you know what? I can see why. It has a lot going for it. It's got that really nice point and shoot camera. The iconic Panda two-tone design was really cool looking, and overall it still has a cult following until this day, so it's undeniable. It's S tier for me. Next we have the Pixel 3, and this was an interesting one. It was the first Pixel phone with wireless charging, if I recall correctly, and I mean, it offered basically everything that was good from the 2 and 2XL. Maybe a better screen. I recall the 2XL having a slightly weird screen in terms of color accuracy. I did use the 3 for a bit, and it was a pretty solid phone. The battery life wasn't the best, but it was also kind of old when I used it, so. But yeah, there wasn't anything crazy new about it. I think the craziest thing is probably that it had 2 front cameras. It had one that was just like a standard camera, and then one that was a bit wider, so that was pretty cool. It also had autofocus on the front camera. That was actually a really nice front camera for its time. It was honestly the best front camera up until like the 8 Pro because it had the autofocus. I'm not inclined to put it in S tier. I'm going to put it above the standard 2 in A tier just because I don't think it really improved upon too much. It just kind of stuck to the same formula with what worked, and it's a pretty safe play. It wasn't really anything too crazy, but it was still a really solid phone. But then we have the 3XL, and that was just, it was basically the same phone as the 3, but the design, it looks ugly. It has that freaking tub notch or whatever they called it. It was a huge notch, and I don't know if Google was trying to prepare for like face unlock in the future to copy Apple, but I don't think that the 3XL having a completely different design was the play. It's still a solid phone. It's just a design holding it back. I want to put a tier below at B tier. It's still pretty fair. I'll put it above or maybe below the original Pixel. Next we have the 3A and 3A XL, and this was the first affordable Pixel. It did a lot of good things. It brought the same camera from the 3, the same 3 years of OS updates, and overall it was a pretty solid package in a phone. It wasn't really what I would say is an insane Pixel, but it did bring a Pixel that was, I don't remember, was it like $399 or something like that? I don't remember how much it was. It was a pretty solid purchase back in the day. I'm inclined to put it above the standard 3 in A tier, just because it brought most of what made that phone very good, but made it a lot more affordable. It did have a weaker chip, but I think the optimization of the Pixel software made up for it, so it was a really solid purchase. Definitely an A tier. Now, next we have the Pixel 4 lineup, and I think this is probably the real first miss Google had in terms of just what their customers wanted. I don't think they really knew what they wanted to do and what their customers wanted. So the Pixel 4, it came out and it only had the facial recognition unlock, and it didn't have a fingerprint unlock. And a lot of people, they they cling onto the fingerprint unlock. I understand how it is. I love me some fingerprint unlock. I don't really do face unlock, but it was a pretty secure option. It had a lot of good stuff going for it. I think they were trying to experiment a bit. It's also the first Pixel with 2 cameras instead of 1. It had a 2 times telephoto, if I recall correctly. You know, it's tough. I recall the battery having a bit of an issue, like the battery life wasn't the greatest. It wasn't a terrible phone by any means, but I do think they missed the mark in some important key areas. It did bring 90 Hz to a Pixel for the first time, which is cool, but I don't know. I might have to put it in C tier. It's really not a terrible phone. It brought a lot of good stuff to the table. I just don't think that they were executed in the best way possible. So overall, I think it's a good phone, but one of the weaker Pixels for sure. So for that, I will put it in C tier. Now, next we have the Pixel 4a, and this was actually a very, very solid phone. It brought a lot to the table for the price point. And overall, I think that just because of how mediocre the Pixel 4 launch was, it really boosted the perception of the 4a because it was just a really solid launch. I do think it's probably S tier. I think a lot of people would agree with me. It's really just retained a cult following, much like the 2XL. It still had the same, great camera for the Pixels. It had a lot of the cool software features. Only a single camera, but it was at a time where it wasn't like a necessity, especially for budget phones, to have 2 cameras. So, I'll give it some slack. I think I'm going to put an S tier. Now, next is a very peculiar release for the Pixel, and that is the Pixel 5. And honestly, I think in hindsight, it was a pretty solid release. It was just a very odd release at the same time because it didn't bring a lot of the flagship features that you would expect from a phone like the Pixel. It used a pretty mid-range chip. It wasn't the super powerful whatever latest Snapdragon it was at the time. And it used a plastic back instead of the usual glass that the Pixel 4 used. So in a lot of ways, the Pixel 4 was still the best Pixel you could get after the Pixel 5 launched, which is it's just very bizarre for that to happen. And if I recall correctly, it's because the Pixel 5, it was supposed to be the phone that had the first Tensor chip in it, the first Google made chip, and it just didn't come into fruition because of the pandemic, I believe. It was definitely a very tough spot to be in for Google, and it was kind of just like we had to get something out this year. What can we do to make it, at least an okay phone? And it did gain a cult following eventually. It had pretty good battery life because the chip was mid-range, but it was actually very efficient for the time. So I do think it's pretty fair to put it in probably B tier, maybe low A tier. It's really hard to say. The 5 was in a pretty tough spot. I'll put it in low A tier. I think low A tier or high B tier is pretty fair for it. Either or could work. But then we have the 4a 5G. Now this is what I feel to be a pretty underrated Pixel phone. It was released around the same time as the Pixel 5, if not the same day or maybe a month or two after. I don't remember honestly, but it was my first Pixel, so I am a bit biased. I will be honest with you. It was basically just a bigger Pixel 5, but it had a 60 Hz refresh rate instead of 90, and I think that's basically the main difference. It also didn't have wireless charging like the 5 did. It was definitely an interesting Pixel to have. I think probably just above the 3XL would be pretty fair. It was definitely a worse phone than a 5, but it is underrated in my opinion, so I'm just going to put it right between the Pixel 1 and the Pixel 3XL in B tier. Now next we have basically the same phone. It's the Pixel 5a, but it had some notable downgrades. I believe it didn't have laser autofocus, and it also didn't have the unlimited Google Photo backups. This was the first Pixel without the unlimited Google Photo backups, so I think that brings it down a tier, honestly. It felt rather redundant, and overall it was just kind of like a whatever release. I didn't really like it that much, so we're going down to C tier. I just put the wrong phone in C tier. Now we're going down to C tier. So I just rated all the pre-Tensor Pixel phones, and I think this is a pretty fair matchup so far. It's not really anything crazy. I think that this is probably the most experimental stage for Pixel, but then the 6 series came around, and I think Google started to kind of find their groove of things. Now, I wouldn't say the Pixel 6 release was perfect. It was nowhere near perfect. A lot of people had a lot of bugs, a lot of connectivity issues, a lot of weird heating issues, but it did bring the first Google Tensor chip in a Pixel phone, and I think that's a pretty solid step in the right direction. I think more competition is great. And the standard 6, it's really hard to say because the 6 and 6 Pro is also the first Pro Pixel ever made, so it kind of complicates things a little bit for me, but I will say the standard 6, I'll put it above the Pixel Pixel 3 XL at least. You know, and maybe above the 5A as well. And the 6 Pro was pretty decent as well. It was my first flagship phone, I guess you could say. So I'm a little biased there too. I'll put it above the 6 in B tier. I think that's pretty fair so far. I don't really see anything wrong with putting them there. They had good value to them and overall brought some really nice camera hardware upgrades as well. That's very important to note because every single Pixel besides the one up until this point, it used basically the same exact main camera, and the 6 and 6 Pro were the first to switch to the 50 megapixel camera that we pretty much know and probably love nowadays, depends on what you like. Yeah, that was pretty notable as well. But then we have the 6A, and that was actually a phone that reverted to the old Pixel 2 2XL sensor. The 6A, I wouldn't say it's a bad phone at all. It brought some important upgrades to the A series, but it was also the first A series to not have a headphone jack. Oh, it also had a 60 hertz screen versus the 6 Pro having 120 hertz. That was the first Pixel of 120 hertz, and the 6 just had 90 hertz. So the 6A was a little, you know, a little iffy compared to the other ones. I think it's a C tier phone. It's not like a terrible phone by any means. It just wasn't a very strong A series entry in my opinion. So I'm gonna put it in C tier, probably above the Pixel 4. Yeah, either high C tier or low B tier would work there, but I'm gonna put it in high C tier. Now I think the 7 series was actually a pretty decent uplift from the 6 series. It did stabilize some of the prior issues people were experiencing with the 6 series. And you know, overall it was a pretty solid lineup, I'd say. It's not really too different from the 6 series. I will put the standard 7 probably at the top of B tier. I think that's pretty fair. The 7 Pro wasn't too different from the 6 Pro. It just kind of brought some more efficiency with the modem, a little better battery life. You know, nothing too crazy. I'll probably put it above the 7 in B tier as well. There's probably a lot of people who disagree with me on these rankings. I'm sorry, okay? This is just my opinion, okay? It's just my opinion. But then we have the 7A, and I think this is actually a very solid A series phone. It brought the first 90 hertz refresh rate to an A series, the first wireless charging to an A series, and overall it was just kind of a very similar phone to the 7. It also used a completely new camera sensor for the main camera, a 64 megapixel shooter instead of the either 12 megapixel old camera or 50 megapixel from the 6 and 7 series. It was a pretty solid step up, I'd say, from the A series, but there was a problem where the 7 was very, very close in price to the 7A, and it was so much of a problem that people were just going for the 7 instead of the 7A at launch. I'll go ahead and put it just below the 7. Still a very solid phone. Not like a lot to complain about. It was just the pricing was a little too close to the 7, as well as the specs and all that. So, you know, still a solid phone, just a little too close for comfort. Next, we have the Pixel 8 series, and this was actually a very solid step up from 7 series. First of all, it was the first Pixel, or first, I think Android phone in general, to have 7 years of OS updates. Very solid step up. It was also the first phone to have a Super Actua display, which basically just means it's a super bright and high quality display. I think the fingerprint sensor was a little better this year, and overall it was just, you know, a pretty solid step up over the 7 series. The standard 8 I will put at the top of A tier, I'd say. It was a solid phone, and you know, I think for the OS updates you get from it and just the overall AI features, it was a pretty solid buy. Now the 8 Pro was also the first phone since the 3 series to have autofocus on the front camera, which I really love me some autofocus on the front camera, so that was a really solid step up. It was also the first phone to allow you to shoot in 50 megapixels on, I think, all 3 cameras actually. Yeah, the main, the ultra wide, and the telephoto, you could all shoot in the 50 megapixel mode, which is really solid. I used that a lot at launch. I'm tempted to put it in S tier, but I know some people will disagree with me. I think that high A tier is very fair here, above the standard 8. It was also the first Pixel phone to have the matte glass back since the 4, and I really liked that. That was a very solid feeling phone. And then we had the 8A, which it was actually a very similar phone to the 7A, the main difference being the OS updates, the nice screen, but it had the same cameras and all that, most of the same specs besides the chip, and it had a lot of the same problems that the 7A had. It was just kind of close to the 8 in terms of pricing at launch, so I'll probably knock it down to like B tier, maybe like above the 7A but below the 7 and 7 Pro. I think that seems fair to me. It's not a terrible phone at all. It was just a little too close to the 8 in terms of pricing and specs, but also the standard 8 had a an ultra-wide camera with autofocus, which allowed for macro mode. The 8A did not have that. So yeah, definitely a B tier phone, but still a great phone. Now next we have the 9 series phones, and oh my god, Google was cooking with these, I'm telling you. My current phone is a 9 Pro, so I'm probably a little biased here, but the 9 and 9 Pro, they're probably the best Pixels in a long time. They really brought some great upgrades over the 8 series, like the ultrasonic fingerprint sensor, even brighter displays. Autofocus on both the 9 and the 9 Pro those cameras. And also this was the first series with a smaller Pro Pixel, which is a very nice choice. I got the smaller Pro Pixel. I really do think that 9 series is probably almost entirely an S tier lineup. So I'm going to put the 9 in S tier, and then I'm going to put the 9 Pro and also 9 Pro XL. They're both in there in S tier as well. These are very, very good phones. Very solid build quality, very solid software so far. And overall, I think Google is finally starting to get all their eggs together, if that's even a saying. I don't know. They're starting to get their stuff together, okay? I'm a big fan of what direction they're heading in, and overall, I'm very happy with how the 9 series has turned out. And you might see that I have 2 folding phones right here. I don't know why I decided to save them for last. I've never used them before, obviously, but we'll start with the Pixel Fold, just the Pixel Fold. And, you know, I think that it was a very experimental phone. It wasn't really like Google didn't have the best understanding or vision of what they wanted to do with a folding phone, so it had some quirks to it. Some people love the form factor, some people hate it. You know, it was a very divisive phone, so I want to put it at C tier, probably above the 6A. Not a bad phone by any means, just kind of experimental and not really knowing, you know, what it wanted to be. But then you have the 9 Pro Fold, and I will argue that this is probably another S tier phone. It brought a lot of what made the 9 series great, but into a folding form factor. And, you know, I think that it's pretty fair to put it probably in S tier. I don't know where it would lie in S tier. I'm going to put it below the 9 and the 9 Pro, just because it's less of a practical form factor for most people, but it's still a very solid release. And overall, this is my tier list for all the Pixel phones ever released. I don't think they've ever released any outright terrible phones. A lot of you will probably disagree with me. Probably a lot, yeah. But I think that this tier list is pretty fair. It obviously has some room for arguments or objective differences. And I want you guys to go ahead and do your own tier list. I want to see what you guys think. Please tell me what you think in the comments, because I'm actually curious what other Pixel fans, or even if you're not a fan of Pixel, let me know what you think. I will pin a comment with the link to this tier list. I made it, so that's cool, I guess. But yeah, I think that the Pixel lineup has come quite a long way. It definitely has not been a smooth road at all for Pixels. It's been very bumpy, up and down, but I think we're finally at a place where things are starting to look up for it. We're starting to gain market share. And overall, the 9 series is a very viable phone series to buy. Anyways, thank you guys for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye!
Thank you for watching.
Thank you to Forever Pyrite, Blind Tech, Fantastic Mister, and KNNXR for being my very valued channel members. I appreciate that.